Our next speaker, our colleague Andrew Macintosh, Associate Professor at College of Law, Associate Director of the Centre for Climate Law and Policy there, and currently Chair of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee of the Australian government. So his research over the years has focused on institutional dimensions of mitigation and adaptation, particularly in the land sector. So Andrew,
thank you, Frank.
The Lorax is yours.
The Lorax, you asked why the Lorax. As usual in these events, I usually get tagged with forests, hence the Lorax. If you don't know the literary reference, I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees, I speak for the trees have no tongues. I'm telling you, sir, at the top of my lungs. Boom, boom. It was funnier when I thought about it. Thank you. Down the front there. And usually my next line after I say that sort of thing is, why does everybody talk about the non-land sectors? And why is it that we always turn up to these events and spend the whole time talking about the energy sector? And then, of course, today I've got Steve, who very inconveniently gets up and ruins that punchline as well. But thankfully, he did help me out a little in that, from what I can tell, and tell me if I'm wrong, Steve, your modelling was about reforestation. So you've identified the intensive agricultural land use zone and then modelled the extent to which it would turn over on certain scenarios. What that excludes, though, is a lot of other roles that forests can play. And so what I thought I'd take you through is a number of institutional issues associated with accessing the opportunities for abatement through forests in those other activities. And I've got them up there. Firstly, the first big issue is what we've gone into now as the second commitment of the Kyoto Protocol. That means we've changed the rules in relation to the land sector, including in relation to forests, and that allows us to access a bunch of new opportunities in previously excluded forestry sectors. The next thing I wanted to go to is the coverage of forests in the ERF, previously CFI, now the ERF, and then finally I just wanted to talk briefly about the role of forests beyond 2020. What Steve has just been talking about was reforestation. Now, as you'd all probably know, reforestation was a reasonably big part of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. We have about 1.1 million hectares of reforestation, which was included under the Kyoto Protocol. The rules, though, for that first commitment period were quite peculiar, even for reforestation, which you'd think is relatively simple. What I'm meaning there is that there was a thing called the harvest sub-rule. It meant that you could get positives, you could get credits from reforestation, but you could never go negative. So you plant trees, you come into the commitment period, you get the credits for the growth and then you chop it down, but you don't have to account for the emissions beyond the 0 point. So quite peculiar accounting rules. What we've got now under the second commitment period is, hey presto, reasonable rules for that sector. We actually have to account for both the emissions and the removals. The second one up there, deforestation. Again, I don't have to tell this audience, deforestation was a large reason why we met our first commitment period targets. And now it's going to be a continuing important player in the second commitment period. Which direction it's going to go, who knows? We have something like 9 million hectares of deforestation land that's now included in the accounts. Once it's deforested, it's always in. So we now have that amount of land in there. For the second commitment period now, the change in the rules has allowed us to do is access forest management. In the first commitment period, we had no protection against, in particular, wildfires, which didn't make a lot of sense. When the forest burn down, typically it's not our fault. After a very protracted negotiations, which I'm sure people in the room can fit you in on, there was an agreement that the impacts of wildfires would be largely excluded, and as a result of that, the Australian government has opted to account for forest management. What that means for you and me is, firstly, multiple use forests. For you, most people state forests, the forests that are harvested. We've now got 9.4 million hectares that come into the accounts. Secondly, we've got the pre-1990 plantations, which mostly softwood plantations, of which there's about 800,000 hectares, or 0.8 million hectares. The next category that comes in is private native forests. At the moment, there's only about 50,000 hectares, give or take, in there, but the reason for that is the only time that private native forests come in is when something happens in there. And what I mean by that is when those forests are harvested, then those land units come in. The final bit there is the other forests. Anyone who knows about forests, we've got about 110 million hectares, give or take. You're probably saying, what happens to them? The question is, they're still out, or the point is, they're still out of the accounts, which is, again, very strange for us because there are opportunities for abatement in those sectors. One example is in a lot of our national parks, there are weed infestations that prohibit growth of the forest. If you go down to Mount Dromedary on the south coast, for example, you will see a lot of degraded forest there. What we could do is get in there and remove weeds and promote regrowth of damaged forests. And thankfully, the way the Australian government accounts for forests allows for us to include those sorts of activities in the accounts. Really quite exciting and not covered in the sort of modelling that Steve has done. That's no criticism, of course, it's just awfully hard to model that sort of thing. Moving on now to ERF coverage. What can the ERF do? This is a second sort of set of rules. If the international rules has allowed us to include a bigger chunk of the forests, then the next question is, what do our domestic rules allow us to do? Well, this is, I think, correct me, there's some of the people from the ERF team here in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, this is essentially the coverage of forests currently in the ERF. So we have offerings for environmental plantings. If you go out and plant biodiverse plantings, you get credits for that. We've got full harvest plantations, a point that's often not known, that you can actually plant trees full harvest and get credits for that. We've also got the third one there, avoided deforestation. A lot of people wouldn't know that avoided deforestation was the second largest component of the carbon farming initiative. We now have, very quietly, we've created effectively a national park that covers a land area that's almost the same size as the Blue Mountains National Park, so a little over 200,000 hectares, and now covered by avoided deforestation projects in Australia. I personally think that's reasonably exciting, and going forward, we're likely to see a continuation of those projects into the future. The next point is avoided reclearing, which is a kind of avoided deforestation. We've just released a new method. Someone in the audience hasn't actually come out yet. Maybe I've preempted the announcement, but it's very close anyway. And that's mostly going to allow avoided reclearing or avoided deforestation projects in Queensland. Again, the point here is there's a lot of opportunity for abatement in this sector, and it's potentially available under the ERF. We've got assisted regrowth, and there's the potential for avoided harvest for private native forest to come in, which is a carryover for VCS projects. Now, I know my time's got to be running out very soon, so the next thing that Frank asked me to talk about was the role of forests going forward. As I'm located in the law school, I have a tendency to talk about institutions, so my immediate response to Frank was the first line up there. You tell me the rules and I'll tell you what the role of forest is going forward. The lesson from the last a decade or more with forest is it's very, very exposed to changes in rules, and one of the big problems here, it's a very polarised and volatile debate. People tend to either love forest carbon or hate it. For mine, I don't quite understand that. Carbon is either in the rocks, it's in the ocean, it's in the soils, it's in the trees, or it's in the air. Last time I checked, we were concerned about it being in the air, and as a result, if it's in any of the other carbon stores, I'm a happy guy. The last point, well, second last, I'll just say, just again to plug forest, because that's my role as the Lorax. Forest is an incredibly cheap way to abate emissions. Steve's modelling shows that, and even if you hadn't done the modelling, a lot of the places where these activities are going on, the land is worth somewhere between $50 and $100 a hectare, and it contains something like 100 to 200 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. Now, it doesn't take a genius to work out with any sort of carbon incentive, then that land use is going to be susceptible to changing over, and thankfully Steve's modelling confirms my suspicions. I should probably finish there because Frank's getting antsy. Thanks very much.